One, two, three, four. I think five next.
Trying to get the Ethernet cable house and it doesn't work.
See Roland Martin on. How's that?
Today is Wednesday, September 15, 2021, coming up on Roland Martin Unfiltered, streaming live on the Black Star Network. Reproductive rights, voting rights are all hot topics across the country. So is the Remove the Stain Act. We'll be joined by the co-executive director of Four Directions Native Vote to discuss that bill, but also talk about the impact of voter ID in this so-called Senate compromise and how the act could actually impact Native Americans. 6 black men in Mississippi are suing pit farm partnerships for hiring white South African laborers and paying them more for the same job. An attorney from Mississippi Center will be here to discuss the lawsuit. The Liberian government preparing for its 200th anniversary of the resettlement of freed slaves in 1822, the country's founding as a republic. We'll talk with the Liberian Minister of State for Presidential Affairs and the Minister of Finance to discuss that big anniversary next year. A new report says Instagram is damaging to young teens' self-esteem, causing rising rates of anxiety and depression among the groups of people who use them. We'll talk with a digital expert about that. In Minnesota, the Supreme Court overturns the murder conviction of a former black police officer, folks. And also in Minnesota, judges put a hold to a new law that governs police use of force. We'll explain that as well. It's time to bring the funk. I'm Roland Martin Unfiltered on the Black Star Network. Let's go.
He's got it. Whatever the biz, he's on it. Whatever it is, he's got the scoop, the fact, the find. And when it breaks, he's right on time and it's rolling. Best believe he's knowing. Putting it down from sports to news to politics. With entertainment just for kicks, he's rolling. It's on go, roll, roll, y'all. It's Roland Martin, yeah. Rolling with Roland now. He's funk, he's fresh, he's real, the best, you know he's Roland Martin now. Martin.
Folks, black women leaders and others took to the Supreme Court today to express their thoughts on Congress passing bills protecting reproductive rights, but also voting rights. The Black Women's Coalition, the Black Women's Roundtable, they were involved in that. We live streamed that particular event as well. Here's some of what took place at today's news conference.
We have to demand that Congress pass federal legislation to protect the right to vote and the right to choose.
Yes.
Right now, we're at a critical juncture in our fight for justice. As state after state passes laws to restrict the right to vote and restrict reproductive rights, it's clear our democracy and our bodies are on attack. At the same time, we're also fighting against a Supreme Court that is hell-bent on destroying Roe v. Wade, as well as our nation's most consequential voting rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For me, the fight for voting rights is very personal. Growing up in Selma, Alabama, no one had to tell me about Amelia Boynton Robinson. No one had to tell me about the foot soldiers that fought for justice and gave themselves, their blood, sweat, and tears, and many died for the right to vote. Old battles have become new again. Surely we thought that our mothers had already fought for reproductive rights and won.
Yes.
Surely we thought that the foot soldiers had fought for the right of every American to vote and won. But we know old battles have become new again. We see over 400 laws just this year being introduced in state legislatures across this nation, trying to restrict the right to vote. And we say no. We say on the foot of the Supreme Court, no, hell no, we're not going back.
Yeah, of course, it's Congresswoman Terry Sewell of Alabama. Of course, she is from the Black Belt there, where so many civil rights battles were actually fought. Now, there's talk that the United States Senate is going to vote next week on this compromise bill being led by West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin. There are a number of things that were stripped out of that bill, especially the ethics pieces. But one of the issues deals with voter ID. Now, although it does not explicitly call for a national voter ID, it does, though, according to Reverend Dr. William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign and others, literally paved the way to a national voter ID when there are a number of organizations and states continuing to fight voter ID in the courts. This issue of voter ID has an impact not only on African Americans, Latinos, but also Native Americans. Joining us right now is O.J. Siemens, co-executive director of Forward Directions Native Vote. O.J., glad to have you back on Roland Martin Unfiltered. And so explain to our audience how Native Americans were specifically targeted in the last presidential campaign over the issue of voter ID.
Sure. And first of all, thanks for having me here, Roland. And I want to congratulate you on your show of the Power Roundtable a few days ago. I think you straightening Governor Christie out, and I think we should name him now Governor Crispy after you roasted him, was pretty good. I mean, it's always good when you confront them with facts and they try to say that the words that you used aren't really the words that they understand. So congratulations on that. You did a great job.
I appreciate it.
First of all, voter IDs are really dangerous, not only to Indian country, but people of color, depending on where you live. On reservations throughout the United States, we do not have residential addresses. And so what is happening is by requiring a voter ID, they require a physical address on that. And so most Native Americans do not have physical addresses. And it is intentional, because I can tell you when we were in North Dakota and they brought this on, it was the 8th Circuit and the Supreme Court that basically said they could have this. And it was weird because during the primary, they were able to vote without that ID. And then it came to the election, or prior to the election, then they required it. So, I mean, it was very intentional. But what happened was these states all over the United States, if you look at your telecommunication bill or your cell phone bill, there's a surcharge on there. That surcharge is used and then from the federal government given to the states. And then the states use that. What they first use it for was to provide those residential addresses within the state. Now, they did it all over the state, but they never did it in Indian country. And then they realized that they didn't do it, so then they required physical addresses. I mean, it's just absurd. So it's a very, very harmful, strategic, surgical, I should say, move to lessen the amount of people that are able to participate fairly.
We talked in Georgia, 150,000 Native Americans residing in Georgia. Native American vote was huge in the state of Arizona. That is a battleground there as well. You, of course, had a Supreme Court decision dealing with the Second Amendment the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. But you also have Arizona Senator Kristen Sinema, who's a Democrat, who has said she doesn't want to get rid of the filibuster, has been fighting that as well. And so many believe that the Native American vote is going to be severely impacted if Congress does not do something with the For the People Act. What is happening? How are Native Americans in Arizona putting pressure on her to say they need her to step up?
Oh, Native Americans in Arizona, all the tribes in Arizona are actually reaching out to her office saying, you know, it's actually harmful to you, because if you look how you won and you look at the number of Native Americans that voted, you wouldn't be sitting there if we didn't show up. Now, if you take and allow this to happen and we can't show up, you probably won't be a senator anymore. But, you know, the thing is, she's got 6 years. And I hate it when people get elected and have a long time before they have to make amends. But I can guarantee you that they are putting pressure on her in order for her to move forward with the John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment, with the People's Act, and actually pushing for the Native American Voting Rights Act, too. So they are letting her know they're not happy.
Is she responding? Is she at least talking with them? Because many other groups, she's just completely ignoring.
Well, that I really can't answer truthfully right now, because I haven't reached out to see if they really received any feedback. But, you know, it's on my list.
Let's also talk about the Remove the Stain Act. Explain to people what that is and what it means.
Sure. In 1869, on December 28th, 1869, Chief Spotted Elk was taking people from the Cheyenne River Reservation in South Dakota and going to the Oglala Sioux Reservation. They were met by the 7th Cavalry that night. They immediately surrendered to the 7th Cavalry. 7th Cavalry escorted them to the Wounded Knee Creek, where the next morning they found an excuse to open up on them, and they killed over 250, mainly women and children. And those soldiers all received medals of honor for that massacre of killing those women and children. It took 100 years to get the U.S. Congress, the House, and the Senate to issue an apology and say it was a massacre, because up until that time, they called it a battle. And so what we've been doing now for the past few years is trying to get Congress to move on taking those Medal of Honors away from those soldiers of 7th Cavalry that killed the women and children there.
And so, first of all, where are we with that? Are you seeing any forward progress?
We're actually moving along pretty good. We got legislation in the House and in the Senate called the Remove the Stain Act. We did attempt to get it put in the National Defense Authorization Act, but the Republican side would not allow us to do that unless we agreed to an amendment. And that amendment was basically saying that, okay, we're gonna let the Department of Defense review it, but we want them to review it with the terms that were used in the 1800s, and basically saying that it wasn't going to happen. So we would not agree to the amendment, and so it did not get out of the committee because it was a 50-50 split. One thing, if I can have a moment,
Sure.
General Miles, who was he's in charge of the overall cavalry, and was awarded the Medal of Honor during the Civil War, wrote this, and it was a confidential letter. And here's what he said about the Wounded Knee. He said, "Wholesale massacre occurred, and I have never heard of a more brutal, cold-blooded massacre than a Wounded Knee. About 200 women and children were killed and wounded, women with little children on their back, and small children, gunpowder burned by the men who killed them, being so near as to burn their flesh and their clothing with the powder from their guns, and nursing babies with 5 bullet holes in them." These are the people that they gave the Congressional Medal of Honor for. There was more medals given there than during the fight on terrorism this past 20 years.
Wow. Well, that's certainly some history many people may not be aware of. We certainly appreciate, OJ, you being on the show. We're going to continue to focusing, obviously, on the voting issue. It is so critical, and we'll see exactly how the Senate is going to move on this next week. And so hope to have you back.
Hey, I always appreciate it. I'll keep an eye on you.
All right. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
You have a good day.
All right, then. I want to bring in my panel right now, talk about, again, the continuing pressure being applied to the United States Senate. A. Scott Bolden, former chair, National Bar Association Political Action Committee. Robert Patillo, executive director, Rainbow Push Coalition, Peachtree Street Project. Lauren Victoria Burke, writer with the NMPA, as well as the GRIO. Lauren, the news conference held today. What was key was that it was Black women leaders, but also you saw them bringing a lot of these white women out as well. We've been talking about that, how too many white liberals have been silent over this issue of voting rights. The reality is it's not just Black folks and Latinos who are going to be impacted, but it's also going to be white folks who live in the suburbs, young white folks as well. And so it's about time they speak up. We've seen Black lawmakers, of course, protest and go to jail. You ain't seen a white lawmaker go down there, led away in twisty ties or handcuffs.
Right. The last few rallies have been more diverse. The one yesterday, the one today, And that is good to see. Unfortunately, it still does come back to the fact that the filibuster has to be ended in the Senate to pass real legislation. I don't care what watered-down Joe Manchin bill has been presented. I'm not sure why the whole big sticking point for Joe Manchin was voter ID. But I guess he's thinking he's going to appease what I would call his Republican colleagues, even though he's a Democrat. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Republican strategy is to make it harder to vote. That's what they're doing in the states. And the only thing that can stop them is federal action. They know that. McConnell's not going to allow it to happen. So there are some really good provisions in this latest bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, one of which is actually to reveal the dark money groups and make them have to reveal who they are publicly. The other obvious thing is to make voting a federal holiday, which that should have been the case already. But I don't know. I don't think it makes any difference. It doesn't matter to the Republicans. They will always be against making it easier to vote because they understand that making it easier to vote means they are going to lose power. And the biggest thing I'm sure that they're looking at is the state of Georgia, which of course flipped with Joe Biden over to the blue side. And they can't have that happen again. So I think this is a kabuki dance, and we'll see what happens next week. But Manchin claiming that he's talking to Republicans is very cute. I don't think it makes any difference. So he still has not identified one Republican that is signed on.
And that's the thing that Reverend Dr. Barber keeps saying. Scott, Manchin keeps talking about bipartisan. Yeah, but show me who you're going to bring along. This was Reverend Barber speaking on August 28th, the anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
We watched two senators hold up everything. We got 58 black members of the Black Caucus, 100 members of the Progressive Caucus, and 2 black senators. What if those 158 members of the United States Congress were to say, you can't get our 160 votes until you do right by D.C., until you pass the Voting Rights Act, until you pass the For the People's Act, until you raise the living wage to 15. You said, Reverend Bobby, that's radical. Well, when we wanted freedom for South Africa, people protested every day in D.C. for 2 years. You can't get this stuff with one rally on an anniversary day. It took 381 days in Montgomery. From Selma to Montgomery, Diane Nash didn't come to the March on Washington. She went to Selma, organized for 2 years before John Lewis and others ever came there. And it took from January to August to get the Voting Rights Act. 8 months! The March on Washington was a day, but it grew out of the Birmingham campaign, which was weeks. And then it continued. So if we want statehood, Madam Mayor, we can have it, but we got to organize to have it. How did Moses beat Pharaoh? He organized for it. How did Joshua bring down the walls of Jericho? He organized for it. How did David bring down Goliath? He organized 5 rocks so he could get his cousins too. How did Esther defeat the plan against her people? She organized for it and said, if I perish, I perish. But I'm going to see the king.
Scott, bottom line is this here. Schumer says there will be a vote next week. I still need to see the numbers. I don't care. I don't buy nothing Joe Manchin says. I don't think there's going to be one Republican who goes along with this compromise.
What did my colleague call it? Did you say a pookie dance or a bookie dance?
Kabuki.
Whatever type of dance it is, it's not going to be a winning dance. We may have a vote, but it's not going to be a winning vote until he brings some Republicans along. And notice the irony of Joe Manchin. He's one vote and is holding up the Voting Rights Act for millions of people. He comes out with his own bill, right? And then he tells you, sit tight, I'm going to bring some Republicans with me. And we sit there with bated breath because we really have no choice, because the White House and the powers of the Democratic Party simply will not do what is necessary to bring him in line, to remind him that he needs to be from the Democratic side of the Democratic Party. And so we'll have a vote, right? But then the voters are going to vote in the midterms in 2022. And the question will be, will black people show up again to give Democrats the majority in the Senate and the House? And in 4 years, will they show up to do the White House and give them the Democratic vote when the Democrats haven't kept their bargain with black voters? Will we show up? And the risk is that we won't, but Biden and the leaders of Democratic leaders simply don't believe that. They want to pass infrastructure. They want to pass the Build America Back Better budget. They want to pass climate change to placate white progressives and white Democrats and white independents, right? But it's black people. It's black people who delivered the White House and the Senate and the House. And now that they're there, we are essentially being ignored. You got to call it the way you see it. And time is wasting. It's getting short. And black people, again, are being ignored and shafted by white Democrats who they gave their vote to. Why should we give them our vote again?
Robert, this was, Lauren talked about the dark money aspect, but this is what Walter Schaub, who used to be the director of the Office of Government Ethics, tweeted out. He said the bill has to pass because voter rights are under attack, but he also laid out what's not in the bill. He said what was stripped out of the bill. He said, these are the provisions that the House of Representatives passed, but the Senate, no. This was a bridge too far for these senators. Somebody should ask them why. It said require POTUS, vice POTUS, plus candidates for POTUS, vice POTUS to disclose 10 years of tax returns. Stripped out. Require the Supreme Court to finally adopt an ethics code, stripped out. Void federal contracts with POTUS vice president and impose penalties for holding such contracts, stripped out. Bar spending federal funds on a business owned by the president or the vice president, cabinet officials, or their spouses and children, stripped out. Authorize the Office of Government Ethics to conduct investigations and issue subpoenas which can be enforced by a district court, stripped out. Authorize OGE to impose disciplinary action, stripped out. Authorize OGE to require agencies to seek OGE's approval when resolving conflicts of interest, issuing waivers, or handling other ethics matters. Require OGE to create a public online database for any records it approves. Require agency ethics officials to provide OGE with a broad array of ethics records and require OGE to post them online. Require a presidential appointee to recuse from any particular matter involving a party who is the POTUS who appointed him or her, the spouse or child of that POTUS, or an entity in which any of these individuals has a substantial interest. Again, all of this stripped out. There are other things that have been stripped out of the bill, and you have to wonder, as he said, what are y'all afraid of?
Roland, this isn't a mystery. If you go into a room full of criminals and ask them to pass laws to regulate themselves, what do you think they're going to do? The reason those things got stripped out is because they got stripped out because these people have no interest in regulating themselves. And let's understand, the For the People Act was already too weak when it passed the House of Representatives. It was not responsive to the new wave of voter suppression the Republicans are doing right now. We're still talking about voter ID, those sorts of things. What Republicans are doing in 2021 is selecting their own voters. Look at what they're doing right here in Georgia. Look at what they're doing in Texas. They're attacking the right to vote in whole